Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They say the past is dead and buried. But here, in one forgotten corner of America, the past is still very much breathing. It lingers in the soil, in the hollowed-out remains of an old farmhouse, and in the family name that no one dares to speak above a whisper. It's the kind of name that makes old-timers quickly glance at the floor. The kind of name that, if you trace it back far enough, will pull you into a story so strange and so unsettling that you'll begin to question the very meaning of family. There are no official books written about them, just fragments, newspaper clippings browned with age, scattered mentions in census records, and a few hushed accounts from those who lived close enough to know but far enough to survive. And in those fragments lies a truth most would rather pretend never happened. The woman at the center of it all was not a villain. She was not a criminal. She was a daughter. But she became something far more tragic when, in the eyes of the town, she was ruined before she had even turned 18. Her crime? She bore a child. But the father of that child was not a stranger passing through. He was not a boy from down the road. He was her father. You may think you've heard stories like this before, grim tales whispered about in rural bars or hidden in the footnotes of old family histories. But this story is not just about one incident. It's about an entire bloodline built on a cycle so suffocating, so twisted, that escape became nearly impossible. A cycle that began generations before her and continued for decades after. In this family, blood wasn't just thicker than water. It was the only thing allowed to flow. Outsiders weren't trusted. Marriage beyond the family was actively discouraged. And somewhere along the line, that insular loyalty crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. The most chilling part is that the town knew. They always knew. But they never stopped it. Because in the isolated hollows of America, the rules aren't written in law books. They're written in blood. And if you're willing to hear it, I'll tell you exactly how it happened. The house and the code. It began in a weather-beaten farmhouse set against the endless backdrop of rural Appalachia, a place where the hills fold in on themselves like a secret, keeping outsiders away and locking the people inside into their own private world. The roads here were little more than dirt veins running through the valley. And when the rain came, those roads turned to mud, making travel nearly impossible. Isolation was not just a condition of life, it was a way of life. The father, whose name still causes unease among those old enough to remember, was a man molded by this land, hard-handed, stern, and steeped in an unspoken code passed down from his own father and grandfather before him. In his world, the family was the center of all existence, and loyalty was demanded, not earned. He mistrusted government men, school teachers, preachers, and other outsiders, and he kept his family close, too close. His daughter was the youngest of 3 children, a quiet, watchful girl with pale eyes and a silence that seemed far older than her years. She spent most of her childhood either indoors or in the overgrown fields behind the house, never straying beyond sight of the property. While other children her age played together in the dusty schoolyard, she was kept home, told the world beyond their gate was full of dangers she was too fragile to face. The mother, herself a distant figure hollowed out by years of living under the father's shadow, rarely intervened. She cleaned, she cooked, and she avoided confrontation. The walls of that house were not filled with laughter, only the low rumble of the father's voice and the quiet rustle of women moving from chore to chore, careful not to draw attention. And then, without warning, the daughter began to change. Her eyes grew downcast, and she grew more withdrawn. There was a heaviness to her that hadn't been there before. In a place where even the smallest change could spark gossips, the neighbors started to notice. Whispers carried over fence lines. The girl was ill, they said. Or perhaps she had been shamed. But in truth, the sickness was not hers. It belonged to the house itself, a sickness that had been festering for generations, hidden behind closed curtains and locked doors. And by the time anyone could see what was happening, it was already far too late. The child she carried was already forming inside her, and the man who put it there sat at the head of her family table every single night. The birth and the silence. When the truth finally began to seep out, it didn't arrive with the force of a scandal. It came quietly, like water dripping through a cracked roof, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore. The local storekeeper noticed her buying fabric 2 sizes larger than before. A neighbor swore she had seen the girl's figure change. But in the valley, people had a way of convincing themselves they didn't see what they saw. The child's father, her own father, never spoke of it. He went about his daily work as if nothing had happened, tending to his fields and his livestock with the same grim determination he had always shown. In his mind, perhaps there was no wrong to confess. For him, the boundaries between daughter and wife, father and husband, had dissolved long ago in the privacy of his own house. The mother did not speak either. She kept her head down, eyes fixed on her work. Maybe she feared him too much. Maybe she knew that to speak would be to shatter what little stability she had left. Or maybe, and this is the most disturbing possibility, she had been raised to believe that such things were simply the way of their family. The town was a different story. The talk was relentless behind closed doors. But in public, silence ruled. This was not just because of fear, though there was plenty of that. It was because the people here were bound by the same suffocating loyalty that kept the family closed off from the outside world. To report him would be to invite outsiders, lawyers, police, social workers, into their valley. And in this place, outsiders were poison. So the girl carried her father's child beneath the gaze of people who pretended not to notice. The seasons turned, the fields grew and died back, and her belly swelled as steadily as the whispers in town. No one came to rescue her. No one offered her a way out. By the time her labor pains began one cold autumn night, the distance around her was impenetrable. The wind howled against the warped boards of the house, drowning out the sound of her cries. The birth was over before dawn. A child, his child, her child, lay swaddled in an old quilt, its tiny breath the only sign of life in the room. And outside, the hills remained as still as they had always been, keeping their secrets for yet another generation. The heir and the burden. The baby was a boy, pale-skinned with a faint dusting of hair the same dull color as the father's. His eyes, when they opened, were the eyes of that family, light, unblinking, carrying some quiet, ancient knowing that seemed unnatural in one so small. He did not belong to the outside world, and perhaps from the moment he took his first breath, he never would. The father treated him not as something to be hidden or ashamed of, but as a rightful heir. He held the boy at the table, showed him off to visiting relatives. Relatives who said nothing, but whose eyes lingered too long, betraying a knowledge they would never admit aloud. In this family, tradition was law, and silence was tradition. For the girl, motherhood did not arrive as joy. It was a chain. Her life, already stripped of freedom, now belonged entirely to the child she had been forced to bear. The father expected her to tend to the boy day and night. He chastised her if she was slow to feed him, and barked at her if the child fussed too long. There was no affection between them now, only an unspoken agreement that she would keep her place and he would keep control. The mother, the grandmother, and step-grandmother of the child all at once, treated the baby with a strange detachment. She held him when the father was watching, and fed him when necessary, but never seemed to connect with him in the way one might expect. Perhaps the boy was proof that she had failed to protect her daughter from the fate she herself had endured. Perhaps he was a living reminder of her own humiliations. The valley accepted this new life with the same grim acceptance it had shown the pregnancy. There were no christenings, no celebrations, just the quiet absorption of another member into a family tree that had long since stopped growing outward. And as the boy grew, he would never be told the truth of who he was. But truth has a way of seeping through the cracks, and in families like this one, it is often the children who stumble onto it first. The boy would grow up catching half-finished sentences, hearing strange murmurs, and feeling the weight of glances that told him he was different. He would not know why. Not yet. Because in this family, the truth was not a story to be told, it was a burden to be carried, and he was just beginning to feel its weight. The cycle closing. As the boy's first years passed, the lines between family roles twisted into a tangle even the adults could barely navigate. He called the young woman Ma, not knowing she was also his sister. He called the man Pa, but in truth, that man was both his father and his grandfather. And yet, in that house, no one corrected him. No one dared. The lie had become the air they breathed, and to break it would be to destroy the fragile balance that kept their world from collapsing. Children in the valley grow fast, hardened by the demands of rural life. By the time he was 6, the boy was shadowing the father through the fields, carrying water from the creek, and splitting kindling. The father spoke to him like a man, passing down lessons about survival, planting, and hunting as if grooming him to one day take his place. But there were no lessons about the outside world, no talk of friends, schools, or the lives other boys were living beyond the ridge. The father was raising a successor, not a son. The girl, his mother, watched from the edges of rooms, her eyes distant. She still moved like someone whose body was not her own, her every gesture cautious. She spoke little to the boy, not from lack of love, but from something deeper, an inability to reconcile her role as mother with the truth of how he had come to be. Sometimes, when he reached for her hand, she would pull away too quickly, as though the touch was a spark that burned. It was around this time that the neighbors began to notice something odd. The boy rarely left the property. He never appeared at Sunday service, never played in the schoolyard. When other children passed on the road, he was called inside. If anyone asked, the father simply said he was needed at home. But in truth, isolation was the only way to keep the boy from hearing questions no one in that house was prepared to answer. And yet, even in the stillness of the valley, rumors have a way of moving faster than the wind. People spoke more openly now. They said the boy was not quite right or simple. They said his manner was too quiet, his eyes too old for his face, his features too close a match to the man who raised him. The whispers were growing sharper, closer, harder to ignore. The resolve. By the time the boy reached adolescence, the unspoken truth had become a shadow that followed him everywhere. He didn't yet understand it in words, but he felt it in the uneasy glances exchanged between neighbors, in the way conversations would stop when he entered a room, in the way older boys whispered when he passed. In a community where bloodlines were everything, his was both an open secret everyone tiptoed around and one that was known and denied. The father seemed blind to it. Or perhaps he simply refused to acknowledge it. He treated the boy with a rough pride, the same way he might treat a prized hunting dog. He expected silence, demanded obedience, and rewarded usefulness. There was no tenderness in him, only a belief that loyalty and discipline were the only virtues worth passing on. The boy, eager for approval, followed his every command, never realizing that the path being laid for him was not one of freedom, but of repetition. The girl, his mother, had grown into a young woman marked by quiet resignation. Her youth had been stolen before it could take root, and now her future was as narrow as the valley itself. She had long since stopped thinking about escape. Her world was the man who ruled over them both, the house, and the boy. But in the silent hours, when the house was still, she sometimes allowed herself dangerous thoughts, what it might have been like to live a different life, to be seen as a daughter, not a possession. It was during one of those still nights that she overheard something that froze her blood. The father was speaking in the kitchen to a visiting cousin, a man whose presence always put her on edge. His voice was low, but his words were clear enough. When he's grown, he'll keep the family strong. We don't need outsiders ruining what's ours. The cousin laughed, a short, ugly sound. Just like you kept it strong. The father didn't answer, but the silence between them was darker than any reply. That was when she understood. The boy was not being raised for freedom. He was being groomed to continue the very cycle that had destroyed her. The same sickness that had passed from father to daughter was now preparing to pass from father to son. And in that moment, she knew, if she didn't find a way to break it, it would never end. The escape. Winter settled heavy on the valley that year, the kind that keeps people indoors and makes the nights feel endless. In that silence, the girl, no longer quite a girl but not yet allowed to be a woman in her own right, began to think in dangerous ways. She had never defied the father. No one ever had, not truly. But now, each glance at the boy's face felt like a warning from the future. She saw the trap closing again. She saw herself in him. She began to watch the road in a different way. She listened for voices not shaped by the draw of the hollow, for the rare sound of a wagon passing. On the coldest mornings, when the father left before sunrise to tend the traps in the hills, she would stand at the frosted window and stare toward the narrow gap where the road curved out of sight. Freedom was there. She could feel it, but it was as far away as the moon. The mother saw these changes and said nothing. Perhaps she silently hoped she might succeed where she herself had failed, or perhaps she knew it was useless to warn her daughter. Either way, the older woman's silence was not indifference. It was a passing of the burden, a quiet acknowledgement that if anything were to change, it would not be by her hands. Then came the night that would decide everything. The father had been drinking, a rare but dangerous thing. His temper was quicker, his voice louder. He spoke to the boy with a strange intensity, telling him he was nearly a man now and that soon he'd have responsibilities to the family. The boy only nodded, not understanding the true meaning behind the words, but she did. And in that moment, her fear crystallized into something sharper, resolve. Before dawn, she packed a small bundle, a thin blanket, a jar of lard, bread. She waited until the father's snoring filled the house, then shook the boy awake. His confusion turned to fear when she told him they were leaving. "Why?" he asked. "Because you're mine, and I won't let him take you," she only said. They slipped out into the bitter cold, the snow crunching softly under their feet. The road was dark, the trees looming on either side like silent witnesses. Each step was a gamble. If he woke and found them gone, there would be no place in the valley they could hide. But still, they walked, because some curses can only be broken by leaving everything you've ever known behind. And as they disappeared into the darkness, the hills remained quiet, holding the secrets of all those who had come before. Secrets that for once might never find their way home.